Hi, it's nice to see so many of you coming back after the break, after the really tasty looking pizza that I didn't get any of, but I'm not jealous. Okay, so this time last week I was in Newcastle. I was at an event that was discussing ISIS. It was an event designed to engage with young people, and their parents of course, but predominantly young people, to try and get at the heart of why people are traveling to Turkey and crossing the border into Iraq and Syria to fight for ISIS. And to fight against ISIS in some cases. And the event was a really fascinating day. On the panel was me, a couple of journalists, and an ex-British ambassador. And two things stuck with me from this event. And I was thinking about them all across the past week, and really trying to understand what people were saying and why they were saying those things. So the first one came from a mother of one of the kids. And she said, I've got an idea why people are joining ISIS. I think I know. Right, okay, this will make my research super easy if you've got the answer. And she said, it's because they're bored. Right, maybe not. But I said, okay, let's engage with this. What's the argument here? And she said, well, when I was younger, I used to have to stand at a bus stop out in the cold, and I just used to have to wait. Right, okay, we all have to wait at a bus stop. This isn't new. And she said, but yeah, I didn't have a smartphone. I wasn't able to get on Twitter, to get on Facebook, to Snapchat my friends. I had to sit and think. Okay, so now I'm thinking, what's the Arsenal score? What's going on Twitter? And I've not been on Facebook for a while. So maybe she's onto something. And then the second one. The second thing came from the ex-ambassador. And he said, I've got an idea for how to cure the ISIS problem. Right, okay, great. Again, making my life easier. And his idea was to implement national service. Right. Again, probably not that helpful. But then he started talking about it more. And then some traction really started to come out of what he was saying. And that what's happening here is questions about identity. And that as a form of national service, he didn't say, let's all join the army. He said, let's have some national service that starts to cultivate identities, to cultivate a shared sense of identity, a shared loyalty. So, okay, maybe he is onto something here. So what I want to do over the next 10 minutes or so is try and engage with some of the reasons why people are joining ISIS. And I think these two ideas will start to gain a bit of traction as I talk. But in order to do this, of course, we need to understand where ISIS has come from. Because, well, to understand why someone's joining something, we have to know what that thing is. And to understand what that thing is, we have to go back 12 years. We have to go back to the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein, and the removal of the Ba'ath Party infrastructure, the infrastructure that held the Iraqi state together, that protected various identities, and of course persecuted many others. But in the aftermath of removing that infrastructure, certain identities became persecuted. Certain identities were securitized. They were threatened by other identity groups that had historically been marginalized and persecuted by Saddam Hussein. And then if we fast forward a further 8 years into Syria, and we see the outbreak of the Arab Springs, the Arab uprisings or the Arab awakenings. And again, we see the Syrian state starting to fragment when the spread of popular protests across the region challenged authoritarian rule. And again, identities started to feel threatened. People started to be marginalized, and this marginalization really became manipulated along religious lines. Historically, the state was designed to protect people, to look after them, to secure them, to protect them. And all of a sudden, this state infrastructure was collapsing. And people were torn. What do we do? Who do we turn to for this security? Who do we turn to protect ourselves against rival gangs, rival ethnic groups, rival religious groups? And in this vacuum, in this fragmentation of the two states, ISIS was born. So the roots of this group are found in the resistance to the American invasion, in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And a really brutal organization that was initially defeated by the Americans, but the key ideologues and militants were put into a prison together, Camp Bucca. And unfortunately, this camp became a bit of a training ground for ISIS, a bit of a breeding ground, I should say, I guess. And some prominent figures started to go around the camps, started to collect names, contact details. When they were all released, they were able to then get in touch with one another and create this group called ISIS. And almost a year ago now, they declared a caliphate under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who, according to the news recently, is incapacitated and is no longer in charge. But that's neither here nor there. So when this caliphate was established, ISIS started to use extreme violence, as we see. They portray this message of strength across the Middle East, offering protection to certain ethnic groups, to religious groups. But they also become increasingly appealing to people in the West. Why is this? So what we start to see is that there's an increasing number of young people who are traveling to Syria, to Iraq, to fight for ISIS. And this is not a new phenomenon, of course. This is a phenomenon known as foreign fighters, where people will travel from the West, from somewhere else in the world, to a certain other conflict zone and take part in the fighting. The roots of this, of course, we can see in the Spanish Civil War, but we can also see in Afghanistan in the 1980s, with people traveling to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets, to fight with the Mujahideen. And so what we see now in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, we see a huge number of people traveling. We see 25,000 people traveling to take part in this, from over 100 different states. So clearly, we've got lots of different motivations, lots of different reasons as to why people travel. There's not just one reason. Because when we look at it, of this 25,000 people, there are different groups that people are going to fight for. Some are going to fight for ISIS, some are going to fight with other Islamic militant fundamentalist groups. Some are going to fight with rival gangs, rival groups, like Shia militias, like Kurdish militias. Others are going because they want to get married. Others are going to provide humanitarian assistance. So there are lots of different motivations for people to travel there. And that, of course, raises interesting political and legal questions about what to do if these people come back. Do we treat them all the same? Or do we treat people differently? Do we treat someone who's gone to fight the same as someone who's gone to provide medical assistance? These are questions to consider, I guess. Questions that policymakers are thinking about right now. But why ISIS then? This is the thrust of the talk, I guess. Why are people traveling to join ISIS? And I think that there are three main reasons. And we should be careful not to say that there is one process that leads someone to have something happen to them, to become radicalized, and then to go and join ISIS. But I think that there are three sets of factors that we need to take into account. One of them, I think, the parent was right, is boredom. And to start to see an appeal in a certain message of strength that is being portrayed by ISIS. This idea of a sense of adventure. This idea of a carefully constructed image. Someone compared them once to ninjas because of the way they dress, all in black. The very carefully styled image in the videos. Another, of course, humanitarian concerns. We've all seen the news, we've all seen what's happening in Syria and Iraq, and the attacks and the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, by Nouri al-Maliki, by Haider al-Abadi, the Iraqi Prime Minister. Awful, awful atrocities being carried out. So there's a sense of affinity to co-ethnic, co-religious kin. So there's a sense that I want to do something to help my brethren, my kin. So there's a humanitarian argument there. But there's also a different thing. And I think this is really getting to the heart of partly of the boredom thing, but also at the heart of why people are traveling. And that's a crisis of identity. People are struggling to find their self in this globalized age where different identities are interacting and flying into one another. And we have people in this room from different nations, from different parts of the UK, from numerous different nations, with different languages, different senses of identity, some of which are challenged from parts within the state. I'm from Yorkshire. This is taking place in Lancashire. And on the whole, I've got to say you've all been very welcoming. But if you go to Yorkshire and say you're from Lancashire, well, that's a different story. But There are also identities that are being challenged from above the state. Different, globalized narratives. And what happens when these identities start to conflate, and when they start to be challenged, and this big melting pot of different identities happens? This idea of ideal men and women, and it just doesn't really make sense. There's a sense of chaos and uncertainty. And I think this is really difficult when you factor in that people are growing up with this. And yet ISIS offers this message of certainty in contrast to this real identity melange. There's a certainty at play here, the strength of message, a clarity of what they're doing, emphasized by this brutal violence. And Osama bin Laden in the early 1990s said that if you're faced with two horses, one's a strong horse and the other's a weak horse, you'll follow a strong horse. It's human nature. And for some, I think this is what ISIS is. ISIS is the strong horse, or it's perceived to be. So I think that's one of the main and possibly most compelling arguments. And as a consequence, that's one of the ways that we can perhaps best engage with and resolve this challenge. But what I want to do now is just consider some of the other approaches, some of the more coercive approaches. So various governments have sought to remove the nationalities of people that travel to fight with ISIS. They've stripped the nationalities. But these are people that have traveled there, that have burnt their passports. So who cares? They don't care. So maybe that's not working. Others have suggested that, well, the parents have to be more responsible. But the parents of 20-plus-year-old people, can they really keep someone's passport? I'm not sure. And then another thing is we start to see this idea of space being restricted. We see government policies dealing with counter-extremism. Now, counter-extremism is a really problematic term because extremism is a subjective term. As of about 24 hours ago, I was supposed to be in Glasgow. I was supposed to be on a friend's stag do. And on that stag do, I was supposed to be whitewater rafting. For some, that would be extreme. But for others, finding out that you've got 24 hours to do a TEDx talk would also be extreme. And Steve, if you're watching this, and Nooper, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. But if you're watching this, then I've got questions about what on earth you're doing on the stag do. But that's beside the point. So I think we need to engage with this idea of extremism. Because we don't want to restrict the space. We want to have dialogue. We want to provide safe spaces in which people can talk through these ideas. We don't want to be restricting it. We don't want to be pushing people to the sides, to the peripheries, where there are dark corners and people who are there to maybe take advantage of this. We want to be open. I work at a university, and that's the point of a university, right? It's to challenge people. It's to engage with ideas. It's to engage with questions about right and wrong and subjectivity, philosophical, political questions. This is really important, and yet we're being pushed into the corners. I think that's really important, that we have to resist this. But then I think as well, we all have a sense of responsibility to this. We all have a responsibility to stand up to perceived discriminations, to perceived marginalizations, to hostility towards different religious and ethnic groups. Because then that starts to reduce that sense of uncertainty. It allows people to feel comfortable in their identities. People to talk to people about their sense of doubt, of uncertainty, and to work through it. And we need to bring those in. We need to bring people together, like events like this, where we bring lots of fascinating speakers together to talk about their views in a safe environment. Not to push people into dark corners, because that's what it's all about. It's about welcoming. It's about talking. It's about dialogue. And Ian was talking about using coffee as a way of resolving conflict. And I'm a big fan of your coffee, so thank you. But one of the great things about a cafe is space to talk, to engage in ideas and dialogue. And that's what I think we all need to do. I think we all need to think carefully about this, to challenge the hypocrisy, to challenge discrimination. And if we do that, if we start to gain traction with these ideas, then I think we have a really good chance of combating the threat of ISIS. Thank you.